July of 1572. The dust of the steppes rises on the horizon like a storm cloud, but it is not a storm. It is something much worse. 120,000 riders of the Crimean Horde advance toward the heart of Russia. The sound is deafening. Horse hooves pounding the earth, the metallic clink of thousands of swords, war cries in tongues that freeze the blood. Moscow still smells of ashes. Just 1 year earlier, in 1571, this same horde razed the Russian capital to the ground. 80,000 people died or were dragged away as slaves. The largest city in the north burned for days. Only the Kremlin survived. Surrounded by a sea of corpses and ruins, now the direct heirs of the Golden Horde have returned. Their leader, Devlet Giray, Khan of Crimea and vassal of the powerful Ottoman Empire, has a simple mission: to erase Russia from the map forever. He wants no tribute, no negotiations. He wants total extermination. Russian spies bring terrifying news. The approaching army is the largest the Horde has ever assembled. 120,000 elite warriors, the best cavalry in the world. Mounted archers capable of deadly accurate shots at full gallop. Lancers who have crushed armies from Poland to Persia, and now they are also accompanied by Ottoman janissaries and Turkish artillery. Terror grips Moscow. Mothers hide their children. Priests pray without ceasing. Soldiers check their weapons with trembling hands. Everyone knows the stories. When the Horde conquers, it leaves no stone upon stone, nor soul alive. But there is one man who does not tremble. A man who bears the title of Tsar, the first in the history of Russia. A man whom history will call the Terrible for good reasons. Ivan IV has been waiting for this moment because this time he has a plan. This time he has a trap. This time he has a secret weapon the Horde has never seen. The Gulye Gorod, the mobile fortress. A wooden wall on wheels bristling with cannons and muskets. A brilliant innovation that will turn the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The question everyone asks is, so, can an army of 25,000 men stop 120,000 riders of death? The answer is about to be written in blood. If you want to discover how Ivan the Terrible carried out the most calculated massacre in Russian history, how a mobile fortress shredded the most feared cavalry in the world, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because what you are about to witness is not a story of desperate survival. It is the chronicle of a strategic genocide. In 1237, the Mongols arrived in Russia like a biblical plague. Under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, they razed principality after principality. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was reduced to rubble. Vladimir, Moscow, Ryazan, all fell. Pyramids built with human skulls. But the worst was not the conquest. The worst was what came after. The yoke. For more than 2 centuries, Russian princes were forced to kneel before the Khan. Every year, caravans loaded with gold, silver, furs, and slaves traveled south. The tribute was insatiable, but there was something even more horrible: the blood tribute. The Mongols demanded that noble Russian families send their sons as hostages. These children grew up in the Khan's court, learning to forget their language, their faith, their people. Many never returned. Those who did were broken shadows of what they had been. This was the perfect strategy to break a nation's spirit. They not only stole their wealth, they stole their future. And when any prince dared to rebel, the response was immediate and apocalyptic. Mongol armies appeared on the horizon and erased entire cities from existence. The lesson was clear: resistance equals death. In 1480, something changed. Ivan III, grandfather of our protagonist, refused to pay the tribute in the famous Great Standoff on the Ugra River. The armies faced each other for weeks, but never fought. The Mongols, weakened by internal divisions, finally withdrew. Russia was technically free, except it was not. Because although the Golden Horde fragmented, its heirs remained: the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, and the most powerful of all, the Crimean Khanate. And these heirs never forgot that Russia belonged to them. Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530 amid chaos. His father died when he was 3 years old. His mother was probably poisoned when he was 8. The boy grew up in the Kremlin, surrounded by greedy nobles fighting for power, ignoring him, humiliating him, treating him as an insignificant pawn. But this boy did not forget, and when he turned 16 in 1547, he did something no one expected. He crowned himself not as Grand Prince of Moscow, but as Tsar of all the Russias. Tsar, the Slavic version of Caesar. Ivan not only claimed Russia, he claimed the mantle of the Roman Empire. He claimed to be the equal of any emperor in the world, and then proceeded to prove it with blood and fire. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan. The fortress city had resisted all Russian attempts for decades. Ivan surrounded it with 100,000 men, dug tunnels under its walls, filled those tunnels with gunpowder. Ivan built St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow to celebrate the victory, that multicolored dome structure that today is the symbol of Russia. 4 years later, in 1556, Astrakhan fell too. Now Ivan controlled the entire course of the Volga River, the most important trade artery in Eastern Europe. Russia was no longer a collection of frightened principalities. It was an empire on the rise. But success unleashed something dark in Ivan. He had always been paranoid, always suspected that everyone wanted to betray him. And in 1560, when his beloved wife Anastasia died suddenly, Ivan was convinced that the nobles had poisoned her. He was probably right. His response was to create the Oprichnina in 1565, a force of 6,000 men dressed in black, riding black horses, carrying brooms and dog heads on their saddles as symbols of their function, to sweep away traitors and bite them to death. These men had carte blanche to torture, execute, and confiscate property. The terror they unleashed was indescribable. Ivan also killed personally. This is the man history remembers, Ivan the Terrible, the tyrant of the mind. But there is another side of Ivan that is often forgotten. He was brilliant. He established Russia's first printing press, reorganized the army by introducing permanent musketeer regiments called streltsy, expanded Russian borders beyond the Urals into Siberia, and crucially understood that technology and strategy could defeat numerical superiority. This understanding will be the key to Molodai. In the spring of 1571, Devlet-Giray assembled a massive army in Crimea, 40,000 elite riders reinforced with Ottoman troops. His goal, to prove that Russia was still vulnerable, that the Tsar could still be humiliated as in the old days. Ivan knew the threat. He had deployed troops along the southern border, but made a fatal mistake. He trusted incompetent commanders and divided his forces. When the Horde attacked, it did so with lightning speed, avoiding the main garrisons and riding straight toward Moscow. On May 24th, 1571, the Tartars reached the outskirts of the capital. They set fire to the wooden suburbs surrounding the Kremlin. The fire spread with unnatural speed, fueled by dry wind. Within hours, all of Moscow was a gigantic bonfire. Survivor accounts are horrifying. Thousands died burned alive, trapped in burning buildings. Thousands more were crushed in the panic as crowds tried to flee. The Tartars hunted the refugees like animals, capturing tens of thousands for the slave market. When the smoke cleared 3 days later, Moscow had ceased to exist. Only the stone Kremlin remained standing, a solitary island in a sea of black ashes. Conservative estimates speak of 80,000 dead. Some historians suggest the figure was much higher. Devlet-Giray did not try to occupy Moscow. He did not need to. He had achieved his goal, proving that the Tsar was powerless. He returned to Crimea laden with booty and tens of thousands of Russian slaves to be sold in the markets of Constantinople. Then he sent a message to Ivan. Next year he would return, and this time he would not leave until Russia was ashes and the Tsar was dead. Ivan was furious, humiliated, but above all cornered. He knew Devlet would keep his promise. He knew 1572 would be the year Russia lived or died. How does an empire survive when its capital has been destroyed and the enemy promises to return with even greater forces? The answer lay in one man and a revolutionary war machine. The winter of 1571 to 1572 was the longest in Russian memory. Moscow was a skeleton of ashes. Hunger loomed. But in the Kremlin, Ivan did not sleep. He spent nights studying maps, interrogating spies. This would not be a raiding incursion. It would be a war of extermination. Ivan knew he could not win a conventional battle. His forces were too weak, too demoralized after the 1571 disaster. He needed something different. He needed a military miracle. Or better yet, he needed to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The first thing Ivan did was fire all the commanders who had failed in 1571. Some were publicly executed as a warning, others sent to monasteries, a polite form of permanent exile. The Tsar had no time for incompetence. To replace them, Ivan chose the most capable man he had, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky. This was a veteran of the wars against Kazan, a man who had spent years studying Mongol tactics because he had been their prisoner in his youth. Vorotinsky knew the enemy from the inside. He knew how they thought, how they fought, and most importantly, how they could be defeated. Ivan gave Vorotinsky absolute authority. Every soldier, every ruble, every resource of the empire was at his disposal. The message was clear: save Russia, or we all die trying. Vorotinsky began with massive recruitment. He summoned all nobles owing military service. He mobilized the Streltsy, Ivan's professional musketeers. He recruited peasants and gave them weapons. He hired Cossack mercenaries from the steppes, men who hated the Tartars as much as any Russian. But the numbers remained discouraging. Even with a supreme effort, Vorotinsky could only muster between 20 and 25,000 men against 120,000. It was a ratio of almost 5 to 1 in an open battle on the steppes, where Tartar cavalry could maneuver freely. It would be a massacre. Vorotinsky needed to level the playing field, and he had exactly the tool to do it. The Gulye Gorod was not a new invention. The word literally means walking city or mobile fortress. The Russians had used primitive versions for decades in campaigns against Kazan. Basically large wooden shields that soldiers could carry to protect themselves from arrows. But what Vorotinsky had in mind was something completely different, something no one had tried before. Imagine solid wooden walls 3 meters high built in modular sections. Each section had wheels or could be placed on sleds. The walls were reinforced with additional layers of wood, and in some cases metal plates. But what was truly revolutionary were the loopholes, narrow openings at different heights designed specifically for muskets and small cannons. Carpenters worked day and night for months building hundreds of these sections. When assembled, they formed a mobile wall that could protect thousands of soldiers, a fortress that could move where needed and reconfigure according to the terrain. Inside the Gulye Gorod, musketeers would be protected from Tartar archery, the Horde's main weapon. They could fire with impunity through the loopholes while remaining safe. Small cannons called falconets could be mounted on elevated platforms, giving them devastating firing angles. It was a simple but brilliant concept, turning a mobile army into a walking fortress. The Tartars were masters of mobile combat, envelopments, hit-and-run warfare. But what happens when the enemy simply refuses to move? When it becomes a hedgehog of wood and metal impossible to flank? Vorotinsky had identified the fundamental weakness of nomadic cavalry. They needed space to maneuver. They needed the enemy to panic, break ranks, flee. Their entire strategy depended on mobility and psychological terror. The Gulye Gorod eliminated both advantages. But there was a problem. For the trap to work, they needed the Tartars to attack. They needed to make 120,000 riders charge the walls again and again until they bled out, which meant choosing the perfect battlefield. Vorotinsky spent weeks studying the terrain south of Moscow. He needed a place that met several criteria simultaneously. First, it had to be on the natural invasion path from Crimea, so the Tartars could not avoid it without a massive detour. Second, it needed terrain that limited enemy cavalry maneuverability, nearby forests, rivers, hills. Third, it needed to be defensible but not obviously impenetrable, because if it looked too strong, Devlet would simply avoid it. He found the perfect spot near the village of Molody. about 60 kilometers south of Moscow. The area was crossed by small rivers and streams, and there were dense forests on the flanks, and most importantly, a series of low hills offering excellent elevated positions for artillery. Vorotinsky designed his trap with surgical precision. He would deploy an apparently vulnerable vanguard to lure the Tartars when they attacked. The vanguard would slowly retreat toward Molody, drawing the enemy deeper and deeper. Then the main army with the Gulye-Gorod would reveal itself. Cutting off retreat, the Tartars would find themselves trapped between the Pakra River behind them, forests on the flanks, and a mobile fortress in front. They could not use their numerical superiority. They could not flank. They would have to attack head-on again and again against muskets and cannons. It would be a slaughter. But the plan depended on one thing: that Russian soldiers maintain formation no matter what. Because if the Gulye-Gorod broke, if the men panicked and fled, then none of this would matter. The Horde would pursue and shred them as always. Vorotinsky spent the last months obsessively training his troops. Endless drills of assembling the Gulye-Gorod, shooting practice, discipline exercises under stress conditions. He made them memorize a simple rule: no matter how many Tartars come, no matter how terrifying their charges, stay inside the walls, shoot, reload, shoot again. Because Vorotinsky understood something fundamental about war. Technology wins battles, but discipline wins wars. In early summer of 1572, everything was ready. The troops were positioned, the Gulye-Gorod was assembled and tested. Scouts were deployed along the southern border, waiting for the first signs of invasion. Ivan visited the camp one last time before returning to Moscow. He walked among the ranks of soldiers, looking at the faces of men who knew many of them would die in the coming weeks. He told them something simple: behind us is Moscow. Behind Moscow are our families. There is nowhere else to retreat. Here we stand, here we fight, and here with God's help, we will destroy the Horde forever. There were no cheers. The men simply nodded. They knew what was coming. And then, at the end of July, the scouts returned riding like demons. The message was brief and terrifying. The Horde had crossed the border. 120,000 riders advanced north like a dark tide. The Horde did not know what awaited them. They came seeking another easy victory, another raid, another city in flames. Instead, they would find their grave. Devlet Gerai was no mere border raider. He was the Khan of Crimea, direct descendant of Genghis Khan, and vassal of the most powerful man in the world, Sultan Selim I of the Ottoman Empire. In the halls of Bakhchisarai, his capital, Devlet considered himself the legitimate heir of the Golden Horde and had a historic mission: to restore Mongol dominion over Russia. Born around 1512, Devlet had spent decades consolidating his power. He had eliminated rivals, forged alliances with the Ottomans, and turned Crimea into the richest state on the Black Sea. His main business, the slave trade. Every year, tens of thousands of Slavic slaves passed through the markets of Kaffa, captured in raids against Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. This trade filled the Khan's coffers with Ottoman gold. But Devlet wanted more than wealth. He wanted glory. He wanted his name remembered alongside Batu Khan, the conqueror of Russia. And after burning Moscow in 1571, he knew he was on the verge of achieving it. The Ottoman Sultan had given his blessing and reinforcements: 4,000 elite janissaries, modern artillery, and military advisors. The message was clear: Constantinople backed the total destruction of Russia. If Devlet succeeded, the balance of power in Eastern Europe would change forever. The Ottoman Empire would dominate from the Mediterranean to the Urals. Devlet was arrogant, but not stupid. He knew the Russians would try to defend themselves this time. That is why he had assembled the largest army the Horde had seen in generations: 120,000 warriors, figure reported by Russian chroniclers based on reports from captured Tartar prisoners. For Devlet, this would be his masterpiece. He would crush any resistance, burn Moscow again, capture Ivan, and drag him in chains to Crimea, then install a puppet prince on the throne. And Russia would pay tribute again as in the old days. It was a perfect plan, except for one detail. He completely underestimated his enemy. The army Devlet commanded was one of the most effective fighting forces of the 16th century. The Crimean Tartars had inherited centuries of Mongol military experience and perfected it with Ottoman technology. The core of the army were the Mirzas, the Tartar warrior nobility. These were elite riders trained from childhood to ride and shoot simultaneously. Each Mirza commanded his own contingent of tribal warriors, men who lived in the saddle and considered war their only honorable profession. The basic Tartar tactic was simple but devastatingly effective: the feint and envelopment. Groups of mounted archers approached the enemy at gallop, fired clouds of arrows, and then withdrew before the enemy could respond. They repeated this again and again, wearing down and demoralizing their opponents. When the enemy finally broke formation to pursue them or simply collapsed from exhaustion, then came the killing blow, the massive heavy cavalry charge that shredded enemy lines. This strategy had worked against Poles, Lithuanians, Hungarians, and Russians for centuries. European armies simply did not know how to counter it. Their heavy knights were too slow. Their infantry could not maintain cohesion under constant arrow rain. And when they tried to take refuge in fortifications, the Tartars simply avoided them and raided the surrounding territory until they surrendered from hunger. In addition to Tartar cavalry, Devlet had Ottoman janissaries. These were professional infantry soldiers, considered among the best in the world. Armed with state-of-the-art muskets and trained in iron discipline, the janissaries could maintain a devastating line of fire. Their presence meant that Devlet not only had cavalry superiority, he also had elite infantry that could assault fortifications. Ottoman artillery, though not numerous, was technologically superior to anything the Russians possessed. Bronze cast cannons capable of bringing down stone walls. In open field, these cannons could fire iron balls that tore apart infantry formations. The Horde's logistical train was another crucial factor. Unlike European armies that relied on slow, vulnerable supply trains, the Tartars traveled light. Each warrior carried dried meat, cheese, and fermented milk. Their horses grazed on the march. They could cover 100 kilometers in a day, something impossible for any conventional army. And then there was the psychological factor. For centuries, the mere mention of the Horde had been enough to sow panic. The Tartars deliberately cultivated their reputation for cruelty. They impaled prisoners on visible roads, burned entire villages, captured civilian populations to sell as slaves. This terror was as much a weapon as their swords. The number said it all: 120,000 experienced warriors, backed by Ottoman technology, led by a Khan hungry for glory. Against this, the Russians could muster perhaps 25,000 men, many of them poorly trained peasants. In any rational military calculation, Russia had no chance. At the end of July 1572, the Horde crossed the Don River and entered Russian territory. Devlet was in no hurry. He let his men raid border villages, capturing cattle and slaves. This served two purposes. It fed his army and sent waves of refugees north, sowing panic and overloading Russian resources. Russian scouts watched from distant forests, counting banners, estimating numbers. The reports they sent to Vorotinsky were increasingly alarming. The Horde was even larger than feared, and coming straight along the main route to Moscow. Devlet was confident. His spies had informed him that the Russian army was small and concentrated near Melody. Perfect. He would destroy them there. And then Moscow would be defenseless. Perhaps this time he would not just burn the city. Perhaps he would occupy it permanently. On July 26th, the Tartar vanguard made contact with Russian scouting forces near the Oka River. There were brief skirmishes. The Russians withdrew, apparently overwhelmed. Devlet smiled. Everything was going as expected. The next day, the main Horde army crossed the Okai and camped on the north bank. Now there were only 60 kilometers to Moscow. Devlet ordered a day of rest. He wanted his troops fresh for the battle he knew was coming. During the night, the Horde's campfires lit the horizon like a city of light. Russian soldiers watching it from a distance felt their stomachs tighten. It was one thing to hear that 120,000 enemies were coming. It was quite another to see the glow of their fires stretching as far as the eye could see. On July 28th, the Horde set out again. This time they encountered more organized resistance. Russian cavalry units harassed them, fired, and withdrew. The Tartars pursued, but the Russians refused decisive engagement. They simply vanished into the forests. Devlet was slightly irritated, but not worried. This was exactly what the Russians always did. Delay, harass, wait for reinforcements that never came. Eventually, they would run out of space to retreat. What Devlet did not know was that every kilometer he advanced put him deeper into Vorotinsky's trap. The Russians were not delaying out of desperation. They were deliberately guiding the Horde toward the slaughterhouse. On July 29th, Tartar scouts reported that the main Russian army was deployed near Molodai. Devlet ordered full reconnaissance. What his men saw confused them. The Russians had built some kind of wooden fortification, but it was not a traditional fort. It seemed mobile, modular. Devlet consulted his commanders. Some suggested bypassing the position and marching straight to Moscow, but the Khan rejected the idea. He could not leave an intact Russian army in his rear. Besides, it was a small force hidden behind wood. His riders would simply surround and burn it. He made the decision Vorotinsky had been begging him to make. He would attack Molody with full force. He would crush the Russians in open battle and then march triumphantly to Moscow over their corpses. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. The trap was set, the jaws were about to close, and what would come next would be one of the most brutal bloodbaths of the 16th century. The dawn of July 28th brought a clear sky and suffocating heat. Russian soldiers had spent the night awake, listening to the distant rumble of 120,000 men and horses approaching. Now with daylight, they could see them. The southern horizon had become a dark sea of movement. Tartar banners waved in the wind. The sound of thousands of hooves pounding the earth was like constant thunder vibrating the ground under the defenders' feet. Some Russian soldiers prayed. Others checked their muskets with trembling hands. The veterans simply waited in silence with stone faces. Vorotinsky watched from an elevated hill behind the Gulye Gorod. His plan depended on staying calm and executing each phase with precision. He had deployed a vanguard of about 3,000 Russian and Cossack riders about 2 kilometers south of the main position. Their job was simple: to provoke the Tartars, inflict casualties, and retreat toward the mobile fortress. By mid-morning, the Tartar vanguard made contact. They were about 10,000 light riders, scouts, and mounted archers. They stopped about 500 meters from the Russian line, assessing the situation. Then, without warning, they charged. The Russian cavalry responded exactly as planned. Mounted musketeers fired a volley that knocked dozens of Tartars from their mounts. Then they turned their horses and galloped north toward the safety of the Gulye Gorod. The Tartars pursued them. Sure, this was another cowardly Russian retreat. It was then that they saw the mobile fortress up close for the first time. The wooden sections of the Gulye Gorod stretched in a line almost 1 kilometer long, forming a continuous 3-meter-high barrier. Behind the walls, thousands of muskets pointed through the loopholes. At the corners and elevated points, falconets and small cannons were mounted on platforms. The entire structure was backed by the Pakhra River, ensuring it could not be attacked from the rear. The Russian cavalry disappeared through gates in the wall that closed immediately behind them. The pursuing Tartars suddenly found themselves 100 meters from a fortress bristling with firearms. Vorotinsky gave the order. The loopholes of the Gulye Gorod spat fire and smoke. A storm of lead swept the Tartar riders. Men and horses fell in heaps. The survivors turned and fled in disorder, leaving more than 200 dead and wounded behind. It was a massive psychological shock. The Tartars had never seen anything like it. Their traditional hit-and-run tactics were useless against an enemy that simply refused to come out of its shell. And getting close meant entering a death zone where muskets shredded them. By afternoon, the bulk of Devlet's army had arrived. The Khan rode forward to personally inspect the Russian position. What he saw filled him with frustration. The Russians had chosen their ground perfectly. Flanking the fortress would mean crossing dense forests where cavalry could not maneuver. Attacking head-on would mean charging straight into a wall of fire. But Devlet had 120,000 men. He could afford casualties. He ordered a large-scale assault for the end of the day, using 10,000 riders in successive waves. He would overwhelm the Russian position with sheer human mass. The first wave attacked at dusk. Thousands of Tartar riders charged at full gallop, firing arrows as they advanced. Arrows rained on the Gulye Gorod, but most stuck harmlessly in the wooden walls. Some passed through the loopholes, wounding or killing unlucky defenders. But the structure absorbed the vast majority of the punishment. When the attackers reached 50 meters, the Russian muskets opened fire. The first line of Tartars vanished in a cloud of smoke and blood. Those coming behind stumbled over the corpses of their comrades and dead horses. Chaos was total. A second wave attacked, then a third. Each time the result was the same. The Tartars could not close the distance. The few who managed to reach the walls found there was no way to climb them while defenders fired downward. Some tried to set fire to the wood, but the sections were wet and reinforced, specifically designed to resist fire. When darkness fell, Devlet ordered a halt. He had lost approximately 1,000 men and achieved absolutely nothing. The Russians, protected behind their walls, had suffered fewer than 100 casualties. That night, the Tartars camped in a circle around the Russian position, at a safe distance from musket range. The campfires illuminated thousands of grim faces, warriors who had spent their entire lives on horseback, dominating battles with speed and mobility, now found themselves powerless before a wooden wall inside the Gulye Gorod. The Russians worked feverishly, repairing damaged sections, redistributing ammunition, tending the wounded. Vorotinsky walked among the troops, congratulating them. The first day had been a resounding success, but he knew the worst was yet to come. Devlet would not withdraw. His pride, his reputation, everything was at stake. He would attack again, and next time he would come with everything. The second day began with bombardment. Devlet had brought the Ottoman artillery to the front during the night. A dozen bronze cannons, each capable of firing 6-kilogram iron balls. At 8 in the morning, they opened fire. The sound was deafening. Cannonballs whistled through the air and struck the Gulye Gorod with impacts that shook the earth. Some pierced the wooden walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. An entire section collapsed when 3 balls hit it simultaneously, killing a dozen men. But Vorotinsky had anticipated this. He had reinforced critical sections with additional layers of wood and packed earth, and crucially had positioned his own cannons to respond. The Russian gunners, though outnumbered, were accurate. They managed to destroy 2 Ottoman cannons and force the others to retreat. After 2 hours of bombardment, Devlet ordered the main assault. This time, it would not be just riders. The Janissaries would go into action. 4,000 Ottoman infantry advanced in close formation, muskets ready. Behind them came 20,000 Tartar riders waiting to exploit any breach. It was the classic Ottoman combined tactic. Infantry to break lines, cavalry to exploit. The Janissaries advanced with professional discipline under intense fire. When they reached 100 meters, they stopped, formed lines, and discharged their muskets against the Gulye Gorod. It was the first time in the battle the Russians faced concentrated musket fire. Dozens of defenders fell riddled with Ottoman bullets, but the Russians had more muskets, far more. As the Janissaries reloaded, the defenders unleashed volley after volley. The Ottoman formation began to unravel. Men fell by the dozens. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain cohesion, but the slaughter was relentless. Then the Janissaries charged with bayonets. It was a desperate but brave move. Some managed to reach the walls and begin climbing. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed they might break the line. Vorotinsky responded by moving reserves to the threatened section. Russian soldiers fought hand-to-hand atop the walls, pushing ladders, stabbing downward with pikes, firing muskets at point-blank range. The fight was savage and desperate. Then Russian cannons fired grape shot directly into the Janissaries clustered at the base of the walls. The effect was catastrophic. Hundreds of Ottomans were shredded in seconds. The survivors broke and fled. The Tartar riders tried to take advantage of the confusion and charge, but found themselves riding straight into Russian fire without infantry support. It was a massacre. Corpses piled so high in front of certain wall sections that they obstructed later attacks. By noon, Devlet had lost more than 3,000 men, including nearly 1,000 janissaries. The Russians had suffered about 400 casualties, many in the desperate fight against the janissaries, but most importantly, the mobile fortress remained intact. Not a single section had broken. The Russians continued firing with the same deadly intensity. Devlet was furious, but also beginning to worry. He had expected to crush the Russians in one day, 2 at most. But now, on the second day, his army was bleeding out while the Russians remained safe behind their walls. Every hour that passed, his numerical advantage meant less. He ordered a complete encirclement. If he could not break the Gulye Gorod with frontal attacks, he would do it by starvation. He would cut Russian supplies and force them to come out or die of hunger. But implementing an effective encirclement against a river-backed fortress was difficult. And Vorotinsky had been sending messengers to Moscow requesting reinforcements. Small groups of Cossacks slipped through Tartar lines at night, bringing ammunition and food. The battle had become a test of wills. Devlet bet that the Russians would eventually collapse. Vorotinsky bet that the horde would bleed out first. That night, both commanders knew the next day would be critical. The third day brought scorching heat. The stench of thousands of corpses rotting under the sun was unbearable. Flies covered everything in black clouds. The wounded groaned in agony, but no one could stop. The battle continued. Devlet decided to change tactics. Mass attacks were not working. Instead, he ordered continuous day and night attacks in rotation. He would keep the Russians under constant pressure, giving them no rest. Eventually, exhaustion would break them. It began at dawn with an attack of 5,000 riders against the western flank of the Gulye Gorod. 2 hours later, another attack struck the eastern flank, then the center, then the west. Again, the attacks never ceased. The moment one was repelled, another began in a different sector. It was exhausting for the defenders. They could not lower their guard for a moment. They fired, reloaded, fired again until their shoulders were black with bruises from musket recoil. Their ears bled from constant noise, and their eyes burned from smoke. But Russian discipline held. Vorotinsky had organized a rotation system where fresh units replaced exhausted ones every few hours. Men could rest, eat, sleep briefly before returning to the line. It was not ideal, but it worked. The Tartars, on the other hand, were beginning to suffer more serious problems. Morale was falling. Warriors who had come expecting easy loot and glory now saw only senseless death. Some Mirzas began openly questioning Devlet's strategy. Moreover, the horde's supplies were beginning to run out. An army of 120,000 men and horses consumes massive amounts of food and water daily. They had looted the surrounding area. But Vorotinsky had ordered all nearby villages evacuated weeks earlier. There was nothing to take. In mid-afternoon, Devlet ordered a final massive assault for the day. 20,000 riders would attack the center of the Gulye Gorod, simultaneously supported by the remaining janissaries. They would break the Russian lines or die trying. The charge was spectacular and terrifying. Thousands of Tartar riders galloped straight toward the walls, shouting their war cries, firing arrows in black clouds. The janissaries advanced behind, discharging coordinated volleys. Russian fire reached infernal levels. Muskets fired so fast that the metal barrels became too hot to touch. Gunners loaded grape shot into cannons and fired directly into the masses of attackers. The slaughter was indescribable. Hundreds of Tartars fell every minute. Horses, maddened by noise and the smell of blood, reared and threw their riders. The wounded were trampled by those coming behind. The ground in front of the Gulye Gorod became a swamp of blood and mud. Some attackers managed to reach the walls. Desperate fights broke out at half a dozen points. Russian pikes clashed against Tartar swords. Men fell from the walls pierced by spears. Stones and boiling oil rained on the attackers. But the walls held, and after an hour of brutal combat, the attackers retreated again, leaving more than 2,000 dead. When darkness fell on the third day, Devlet had lost approximately 6,000 men in total. The Russians had lost around 800. The casualty ratio was catastrophic for the Tartars, but they still had a huge numerical advantage. However, something had changed. The Russian soldiers who began the battle terrified now felt confident. They had held for 3 days against the most feared force in the world. They had killed thousands without being defeated. They began to believe they could win. And Vorotinsky knew it was time to shift from defense to offense. The trap had worked. The Tartars were bleeding. Now was the time to close the jaws and crush them completely. The morning of the 4th day brought a change in Tartar tactics. Devlet finally accepted that frontal attacks were suicidal. He had lost 6,000 men against wooden walls and had nothing to show for it except mountains of corpses. Now he would try what he should have done from the beginning, a complete encirclement. He ordered his commanders to deploy the army in a gigantic ring around the Gulye Gorod. Detachments of 5,000 riders patrolled constantly, intercepting any Russian attempt to bring supplies or send messengers. Ottoman artillery maintained intermittent bombardment, not to break the walls, but to keep the defenders exhausted and nervous. It was a solid strategy in theory, with 114,000 men still available. Devlet could afford to completely surround the Russian position and simply wait, without food or water. The Russians would have to surrender or starve. But there was a critical problem Devlet had not fully considered. The Pokhara River flowed directly behind the Gulye Gorod. The Russians had unlimited access to fresh water, and Vorotinsky had been smart enough to store food inside the defensive perimeter before the battle. He had supplies for at least 2 weeks. Devlet, on the other hand, had increasingly serious supply problems. His foragers had cleaned the surrounding area of food in the first days. Now foraging patrols had to travel farther and farther, making them vulnerable to Cossack ambushes. The Tartar horses, the soul of their army, were beginning to weaken from lack of proper forage. Moreover, dysentery had begun to spread through the Tartar camp. With more than 100,000 men camped in a relatively small area, sanitary conditions were horrible. Unburied corpses from previous days made it worse. Hundreds of warriors fell ill daily during these 2 days. Devlet ordered night attacks to maintain psychological pressure on the Russians. Groups of 1,000 or 2,000 riders attacked in the dark, firing incendiary arrows, shouting, trying to sow panic. Russian defenders responded with musket volleys into the shadows, wasting ammunition on barely visible targets. But Vorotinsky did not sit idle. He organized his own night raids. Groups of 200 or 300 Cossacks and elite soldiers slipped out of the Gulye Gorod in darkness. They attacked sections of the Tartar camp, killed sleeping guards, set fire to tents, and disappeared before an effective response could be organized. These raids had a disproportionate effect on Tartar morale. Warriors who had spent the day attacking the walls now could not sleep at night. Fearing being throat-slit in the dark, accumulated exhaustion began to break discipline. On the 5th day, Vorotinsky received reinforcements. 3,000 fresh musketeers from Moscow had managed to infiltrate through Tartar lines at night. Guided by Cossacks who knew every path and stream, they were not many, but their arrival greatly boosted Russian morale. It meant Moscow had not abandoned them, that the Tsar still believed in victory. Devlet intercepted some of these reinforcement groups and massacred them, but enough got through to worry him. If the Russians could bring reinforcements continuously, his numerical advantage would gradually erode. He needed to force a quick decision. In the afternoon of the 5th day, he called a war council with his main commanders. The discussion was heated. Some Mirzas argued they should withdraw. They had suffered more than 7,000 casualties and had nothing to show. The campaign was a disaster. Better to return to Crimea, regroup, and come back next year. Others argued that withdrawing now would be a catastrophic humiliation. How would they explain to the Ottoman Sultan that 120,000 warriors had been stopped by 25,000 Russians hiding behind wooden walls? Ridicule would haunt them for generations. Devlet made the decision. One last massive assault the next day. He would launch 50,000 warriors simultaneously against the Gulye Gorod from all sides. They would overwhelm the Russian defenses by sheer mass, and this time he would personally lead the final charge. But what Devlet did not know was that Vorotinsky was also planning something. something that would completely change the course of the battle. Accustomed to combat on open steppes under clear skies, felt uneasy. They could not see the enemy, could not assess their movements. Vorotensky had been waiting for exactly these conditions. He had noticed the morning fog pattern in previous days, and now with the horde preparing for its massive assault, it was the perfect time to strike first. At 5 in the morning, while most of the Tartar camp was still sleeping, the gates of the Gulye Gorod opened. 5,000 Russian soldiers emerged in absolute silence, divided into 10 columns of 500 men each. They were Vorotensky's best troops, Streltsy, veterans, Don Cossacks, and nobles in full armor. The columns advanced through the fog like ghosts. Tartar guards did not see them until it was too late. Russian bayonets struck silently, slitting sentries' throats before they could scream. Within minutes, the Russians were inside the camp perimeter. Then the massacre began. Russian muskets opened fire at point-blank range into tents full of sleeping warriors. The explosions awoke the camp in total chaos. Half-naked men stumbled out of tents, searching for weapons, not understanding what was happening. The Russians killed them systematically, moving from tent to tent. The fog amplified the confusion. Tartars fired into shadows, frequently killing their own comrades. They could not organize, could not form defensive lines. It was guerrilla combat in the heart of their own camp. One Russian column reached the horse corrals. They killed the guards, then shot the animals or scattered them in panic. Thousands of Tartar horses fled galloping into the steppes, taking with them the mobility that was the heart of the horde's military power. Another column reached the Tartar supply train and set fire to food and ammunition wagons. Flames rose to the sky, visible even through the fog, marking a beacon of destruction. Devlet, awakened by the chaos, desperately tried to organize a response. He gathered his personal guard, about 2,000 elite riders, and charged where he thought the Russians were. But in the fog, he simply galloped in circles while his men were killed around him. After 2 hours of chaotic combat, Vorotensky sounded the retreat horn. The Russian columns disengaged and ran back to the Gulye Gorod, carrying prisoners, captured weapons, and Tartar banners as trophies. When the fog lifted at noon, Devlet could finally assess the damage. It was catastrophic. Approximately 10,000 of his warriors lay dead, many killed while sleeping. Thousands of horses had disappeared. His supply train was destroyed, and worst of all, his army's morale was shattered. The Russians, on the other hand, had lost fewer than 300 men in the raid. It was a brilliant tactical victory that completely changed the psychological balance of the battle. The defenders had become attackers. The cornered Russians had sallied out and struck the giant, but Devlet could not withdraw now. Not after so much bloodshed. He ordered the massive assault to continue as planned. 50,000 warriors would attack that same afternoon. It was at that moment that news arrived that would change everything. Scouts reported dust columns to the north. A Russian reinforcement army was approaching. 5,000 men under Prince Dmitry Kvorostinin, an aggressive commander known for his audacity. Devlet now faced a strategic nightmare. If he launched his massive assault against the Gulye Gorod, he would leave his rear exposed to the Russian reinforcements. But if he divided his forces to face Kvorostinin, he would fatally weaken his main attack. He made the most sensible decision. Divide his army. 30,000 would remain besieging the Gulye Gorod. The other 84,000 would march north to destroy the reinforcements before they could join Vorotensky. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. Vorotensky and Kvorostinin had coordinated this perfectly. The reinforcements were not coming to shelter in the Gulye Gorod. They were coming to be the hammer against the anvil. The seventh day began with Devlet leading 84,000 warriors north to intercept Kvorostinin. He engaged them 15 kilometers from Melody in an area of rolling hills and scattered forests. Kvorostinin, a brilliant commander, had chosen his position carefully. He deployed his 5,000 men on the slopes of a wooded hill with dense forest at his back, providing an escape route if needed. He had some light cannons and enough muskets to make any attack costly. Devlet ordered an immediate attack. He was furious, frustrated, and making mistakes. He launched wave after wave of cavalry against Khvorostinen's position. The Russians shredded them with disciplined fire, yielding ground slowly but inflicting horrible casualties. Meanwhile, at Molody, Vorotinsky saw his opportunity. The 30,000 Tartars left besieging the Gulye Gorod were insufficient to maintain an effective encirclement. He opened all the gates of the mobile fortress and launched his entire army against them. It was a wild, desperate charge. 20,000 Russian soldiers sallied out shouting, firing muskets at point-blank range, striking with pikes and swords. The Tartars, taken completely by surprise, broke ranks almost immediately. What followed was a relentless pursuit. The Russians took no prisoners. They hunted the retreating Tartars through forests and streams, killing anyone they could reach. The Cossacks in particular were merciless, remembering centuries of Tartar raids against their people. Vorotinsky then did something bold to the point of recklessness. He left a rearguard force to protect the Gulye Gorod and marched north with 15,000 men to join Khvorostinen. The pincer was closing on Devlet. When the two Russian armies united in mid-afternoon, Devlet found himself in an impossible position. He was being attacked from two directions. His army, after days of non-stop combat, was exhausted. The horses were spent. Supplies had run out. And now the Russians who were supposedly cornered were enveloping him. The Khan tried to organize an orderly retreat, but when an army of 100,000 begins to retreat, especially one that has lost confidence in its leader, retreat quickly becomes rout. And when panic sets in, rout becomes annihilation. What happened in the following hours was one of the most spectacular bloodbaths of the 16th century. The Russians pursued the retreating horde for kilometers. Tartars on exhausted horses could not flee fast enough. Columns of fugitives became perfect targets for Russian muskets. Streams and rivers became deadly traps. Thousands of Tartars tried to cross the Pakhra River simultaneously. They pushed each other into the water. Many drowned under the weight of their armor. Those who managed to cross were shot down by musket fire from the opposite bank. The forest the Tartars hoped would provide cover became mazes of death. Cossacks, experts in forest combat, hunted them among the trees, and groups of Tartars surrendered only to be summarily executed. Russian thirst for revenge for centuries of humiliation had been unleashed, and it was unstoppable. Devlet Giray, the proud Khan of Crimea, fled with barely 6,000 survivors of his personal guard. He abandoned his tent, his banners, his artillery, everything. His only concern was to escape alive. When darkness fell on the seventh day, the pursuit finally ended. The Russian soldiers were too exhausted to continue, but the damage was done. The battlefield and surrounding areas were covered with between 30,000 and 40,000 Tartar corpses. Some historians suggest the actual figures were even higher, possibly 50,000 or more when counting those who died in the following days from wounds. According to Russian chroniclers, the Pakhra River flowed red with blood for days. Wolves and crows feasted for weeks. The stench was so terrible that villages within a 15-kilometer radius had to be temporarily evacuated. The Crimean Horde, the most feared military force in Eastern Europe, had been shattered. Of 120,000 warriors who had confidently marched toward Moscow, fewer than 20,000 returned to Crimea. The rest lay dead in the fields around Molody or had been captured. The Battle of Molody was over, and with it, the Mongol threat to Russia was over forever. Devlet Giray's flight was pathetic for a man who had burned Moscow just 1 year earlier. The Khan, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his personal guard, rode day and night south. He did not stop to eat, did not stop to sleep. The terror of being captured by the Russians kept him moving. Cossacks pursued him for days, hunting stragglers like wolves stalking a wounded pack. Groups of exhausted Tartars on dying horses were overtaken and massacred. Some tried to surrender, offering ransom, begging for mercy. They received none. The Cossacks remembered too many burned villages, too many enslaved families. When Devlet finally crossed the Don and reached safe territory, only between 10,000 and 15,000 men remained with him. From an army of 120,000, it was a loss rate of 85 to 90%. In military terms, it was not just a defeat, it was an extermination. The wounded were abandoned on the road, without medical supplies, without transport. They were simply left to die on the steppes. Russian villagers who found these men showed no mercy. Centuries of Mongol terror had hardened hearts. Captured prisoners faced varied fates. Tartar nobles and Ottoman janissaries were taken to Moscow in chains. Ivan paraded them publicly through the streets as trophies. Some were executed in elaborate public ceremonies, impaled or beheaded before celebrating crowds. Others were ransomed for huge sums that filled Russia's empty treasury. Common warriors captured were sold as slaves or forced to work on construction projects. Ironically, many ended up building the new fortifications that would protect Russia from future invasions. The captured booty was massive: thousands of horses, hundreds of supply wagons, Ottoman artillery, weapons, armor, and war banners. The banners were hung in St. Basil's Cathedral as permanent reminders of the victory. Some are still preserved in Russian museums today. But the true booty was intangible. The Horde had been psychologically broken. The aura of invincibility that had terrified Eastern Europe for centuries evaporated in 7 days of carnage. When the first messengers reached Moscow with news of the victory, people simply did not believe it. It seemed too good to be true. The Horde, the same Horde that had burned the capital the previous year, had been annihilated. But when more messengers arrived, bringing captured banners and chained prisoners, reality sank in. Moscow erupted in celebrations. Bells rang in all churches for days. Religious processions filled the streets. 3 days of national holiday were declared. Ivan the Terrible ordered Thanksgiving services in every church in the country. He proclaimed that the victory was proof of divine favor upon Russia. God had chosen the Russians to defeat the infidel Mongols. The Tsar generously rewarded Vorotinsky. He granted him lands, titles. Other commanders were also rewarded according to their contribution. Rank-and-file soldiers received cash bonuses and land. Many peasants who fought at Molody were freed from serfdom as reward. It was an unprecedented gesture that further elevated Ivan's prestige. Commemorative churches were ordered built in Molody and Moscow. One of these, the Church of the Intercession of the Mother of God, was built on the exact site where the Gulye Gorod had stood. It became a place of pilgrimage. Russian chroniclers worked feverishly to document the battle. Their accounts, though often exaggerated, preserved the basic details of how an inferior force defeated a massive enemy through technological innovation and tactical brilliance. News of Molody reached Constantinople like lightning. Sultan Selim I was furious. He had invested significant resources in Devlet's campaign, janissaries, artillery, advisors, and all had been destroyed or captured. The captured janissaries, eventually ransomed, brought humiliating reports. They told how a wooden fortress had stopped the largest army Crimea had ever assembled, how Russian muskets had shredded them, how their proud cavalry had been reduced to piled corpses. Selim ordered a full investigation. How had this happened? Ottoman military reports concluded that Devlet had committed fundamental tactical errors, attacking a fortified position without proper reconnaissance, underestimating Russian capabilities, failing to secure supply lines. But the most important conclusion was strategic. The era of dominant nomadic cavalry was over. Firearms and mobile fortifications had fundamentally changed the balance of power. The Ottomans needed to adapt their own tactics or face similar defeats. Ottoman support for Crimea was drastically reduced after Molody. Selim had his own problems. Wars in the Mediterranean, rebellions in the Balkans. He could not afford to waste more resources on failed Crimean adventures. Devlet received a cold letter from the Sultan, basically blaming him for the debacle and warning that he should not expect significant further help. The Khan, now humiliated and weakened, spent the rest of his reign trying to rebuild his army. He never regained his former strength. Throughout Eastern Europe, the balance of power shifted. Poland and Lithuania, which had lived in constant fear of Tartar raids, saw that the monster could be defeated. They began adopting similar tactics, building mobile fortifications and emphasizing firepower over heavy cavalry. Venetian and Genoese merchants on the Black Sea reported that slave prices skyrocketed because Tartar raids had almost completely ceased. The source of slaves that had fed Mediterranean markets for centuries had suddenly dried up. Russian diplomacy was transformed. European embassies in Moscow began treating Ivan with new respect. He was no longer the ruler of a marginal barbaric principality. He was the Tsar who broke the Horde. He was someone who could be a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy. England in particular sought closer relations. The Muscovy Company dramatically expanded trade. English military advisors arrived to study the Gorod and other Russian innovations. Molody had announced that Russia was a major European power, no longer to be ignored or scorned. The giant of the East had awakened, and it had done so in the most violent and bloody way possible. Molody was not simply a battle. It was the endpoint of an era that had lasted almost 3.5 centuries. Since Batu Khan ravaged Russia in 1237, Slavic peoples had lived under the shadow of Mongol terror. Entire generations were born, lived, and died without knowing a single day of true freedom from tribute, raids, and constant humiliation. After August 3rd, 1572, that shadow disappeared forever. Devlet Juray attempted one last raid in 1573, but it was a pathetic force of barely 15,000 men, a fraction of his former power. The Russians repelled them easily without even needing the Gorod. The Khan died in 1577, a broken man who had seen his dream of restoring the Golden Horde die in the fields of Molody. His successors never attempted another large-scale invasion. They simply lacked the capacity. Crimea's warrior elite, the experienced Mirzas who had formed the core of Tatar military power, had been annihilated. It would take generations to replace them. And by then, the technological balance had irrevocably shifted in favor of states with firearms. Tatar raids continued, of course, but they were small operations, glorified banditry, not the apocalyptic invasions of the past. And with each passing decade, they became less frequent and less successful. Russia built a line of fortifications along its southern border, the Abatis Line, turning the steppes into a militarized zone where Tatars could no longer operate with impunity. By 1783, Catherine the Great simply annexed the Crimean Khanate to the Russian Empire. The wheel had turned completely. Descendants of the Mongol conquerors were now subjects of the empire they once dominated. But Molody did more than end the military threat. It freed Russian national energy for expansion. With the southern border finally secure, Ivan and his successors could look east. The conquest of Siberia accelerated dramatically after 1572. In less than a century, Russia would stretch from Poland to the Pacific Ocean, becoming the largest territorial empire the world had seen. Molody was in many ways the birth of Russia as a superpower. The country that had been trampled and humiliated for centuries suddenly found itself free to pursue its own destiny. And that destiny proved imperial on a scale even Ivan could barely imagine. The mobile fortress that saved Russia at Molody deserves a place in the history of military innovation alongside tanks, airplanes, and nuclear weapons. Because the Gorod represented something revolutionary. The ability to combine strategic mobility with impenetrable tactical defense. Before Molody, armies faced a fundamental trade-off. You could build massive fortifications that were practically impregnable, but then you were static, unable to project power. Or you could have a mobile army that could maneuver, but then you were vulnerable to open field attacks, especially against superior cavalry. The Gorod broke that paradigm. Vorotinsky had created a fortress that could move where needed and then instantly become a formidable defensive position. It was the 16th century equivalent of a tank, mobile protection combined with massive firepower. Modern military historians who have studied Molody are amazed at how advanced the concept was. 20th century mechanized forces operated under surprisingly similar principles. Use mobility to reach a favorable position, then use protection and firepower to destroy the enemy. So why did the Gorod not revolutionize European warfare? Why are there no massive references to it in Western military treatises? The answer is partly geographical. The Gorod worked brilliantly on the open steppes and forests of Eastern Europe, where terrain allowed deployment of large modular structures. But in the mountains of Italy, the swampy Low Countries, or the dense forests of Germany, it was much less practical. It was also a matter of military culture. Western European armies were heavily investing in permanent fortifications and siege artillery. The dominant model of war was prolonged siege, not open field battle against nomadic hordes. They did not need the Gulye Gorod because they did not face the type of enemy it was designed against. But the Russians continued using it for decades after Molody. Improved versions of the Gulye Gorod appeared in campaigns against Sweden, Poland, and the Siberian Khanates. Each generation of Russian military engineers refined it, making it lighter, stronger, more modular. Eventually, technological progress made it obsolete. Artillery improved to the point where it could shatter even reinforced mobile fortifications. Infantry tactics evolved toward linear formations that could produce massive firepower without needing static protection. But during a crucial moment in history, the Gulye Gorod was the difference between Russia's survival and extinction. That moment was enough. Molody poses an uncomfortable question about Ivan I. How do we judge a man who saved his nation but terrorized his own people? Because Ivan did not become less terrible after Molody. If anything, he became worse. The last years of his reign were a downward spiral of paranoia, violence, and destruction. In 1570, a year before the Moscow disaster, Ivan had sacked Novgorod, massacring between 3,000 and 60,000 of his own citizens based on unfounded suspicions of treason. In 1581, as mentioned earlier, he killed his own son in a fit of rage. The dynasty he had built almost died with him. When Ivan finally died in 1584, he left Russia in chaos. His surviving son Fyodor was mentally weak. The period that followed, the time of troubles, almost destroyed the country Ivan had saved. Yet the Russians never forgot Molody, even during Ivan's worst excesses. Chroniclers continued writing about the great victory because Ivan, with all his monstrous flaws, had achieved something no previous Russian ruler had managed. He had completely freed Russia from the Horde. Modern Russian historians are divided about Ivan. Some see him as a psychopathic tyrant whose paranoia and cruelty almost destroyed the country. Others argue that his brutality, though excessive, was necessary to consolidate central power in a period of precarious national existence. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Ivan was a deeply damaged man from childhood trauma, brilliant but unstable, capable of strategic vision but also impulsive cruelty. He was a product of his time, an era when violence was the currency of politics and compassion was considered weakness. But one thing is undeniable. Without Ivan, without his willingness to trust Vorotinsky, without his understanding that technology could defeat numerical superiority, Molody would not have happened. And without Molody, Russia as we know it probably would not exist. It is a complicated legacy, but history is rarely simple. What can Molody teach us more than 4 centuries later? There are lessons applicable to our modern world. The first lesson is about innovation under pressure. Vorotinsky did not invent the Gulye Gorod from scratch. He took an existing concept and brilliantly adapted it to solve a specific problem. In times of crisis, smart incremental innovation often defeats the search for completely new solutions. The second lesson is about turning weaknesses into strengths. So they changed the rules. They forced the Tatars to fight the kind of battle where Russian advantages, discipline, and firepower mattered more than Tatar numerical superiority. The third lesson is about leadership. Vorotinsky understood that technology alone does not win battles. You need soldiers who maintain discipline under extreme pressure. He spent months training his troops, not just in technique, but in psychological resilience. When the moment came, his men did not break. And that discipline was as important as the Gulye Gorod itself. The fourth lesson is about the nature of historical change. Molody fundamentally changed the balance of power in Eastern Europe, but very few contemporary Western Europeans noticed. It happened on the periphery, far from established centers of power, yet its effects reverberated for centuries. History is not always made in the places historians are watching. Sometimes the most important events happen in obscure places, decided by people no one has heard of, using methods no one understands until much later. 120,000 warriors marched toward Molody in July of 1572. Fewer than 20,000 returned. The rest remained dead in the fields, drowned in rivers, or marching chain to Moscow. It was one of the most disproportionate victories in military history. An army outnumbered 5-1 not only survived, but annihilated its enemy. It did so through strategic brilliance, technological innovation, and inflexible courage. But more than that, Molody was the day Russia finally rose from its knees. For 240 years, the Russian people had paid tribute, sent their sons as hostages, watched their cities burn. For 240 years, they had lived in fear, in 7 days of carnage. In August of 1572, that fear died. The shadow of the horde that had darkened Eastern Europe for centuries finally dissipated. Molody is not as famous as it should be. There are no big Hollywood movies about it. It does not appear in most Western textbooks. But to understand Russian history, to understand how a besieged principality became an empire stretching from Europe to the Pacific,